Folks, if you're just signing on, we're just waiting for a few more people to log in. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah from Politics and Prose, and we are live with Kathryn Schulz and Clint Smith discussing Lost and Found. You can find a link in the chat to purchase your copy of the book directly from Politics and Prose. If you have a question for our speakers, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to everyone's questions during the last portion of the discussion, though we apologize in advance if we run short on time. Additionally, we're glad to offer closed captioning for this event via Zoom's auto captioning service. To enable captions, click on the CC Live transcript icon at the bottom of your screen. Before we begin, we want to sincerely thank you for joining us. We're so grateful to all our customers who keep our business and our spirits afloat. And let's get to the book. 18 months before Kathryn Schulz's beloved father died, she met the woman she would marry. In Lost and Found, she weaves the stories of those relationships into a brilliant exploration of how all our lives are shaped by loss and discovery, from the maddening disappearance of everyday objects to the sweeping devastations of war, pandemic, and natural disaster, from finding new planets to falling in love. The resulting book is part memoir, part guidebook to living in a world that is simultaneously full of wonder and joy, and wretchedness and suffering, a world that always demands both our gratitude and our grief. Kathryn Schulz is a staff writer at The New Yorker and the author of Being Wrong. She won a National Magazine Award and a Pulitzer Prize for the really big one, her article about seismic risk in the Pacific Northwest. Lost and Found grew out of Losing Streak, a New Yorker story that was anthologized in the Best American Essay. Clint Smith is a staff writer at The Atlantic. He is the author of the narrative nonfiction book, How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America, which was the #1 New York Times bestseller and one of the New York Times top 10 books of 2021. He is also the author of the poetry collection, Counting to Scent, which won the 2017 Literary Award for Best Poetry Book from the Black Caucus of the American Library Association and was a finalist for an NAACP Image Award. He has received fellowships from New America, the Emerson Collective, the Art for Justice Fund, Cave Canem, and the National Science Foundation. On behalf of Politics and Prose, please join me in welcoming Kathryn Schulz and Clint Smith.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that wonderful introduction. Kathryn, it's so good to be here with you.
Clint, I'm so delighted to be having this conversation.
This is like a long-time listener, first-time caller situation for me because I've been following. For those watching, I've been following and admiring Kathryn's work for so long. This is I was gonna say this is the first time we've met in person, but like this is the pandemic version of in person. This is as close as we've gotten, and I know it won't be the last. But the first thing that I want to do before we do anything else, because we've had 2 years of these virtual online events. I launched a book in the virtual world. Everybody over the last 2 years has. I know that this is very different than a bookstore where like you go in and you hear the person talk and then you go get the book and you get to talk to them, get the autograph. Sometimes people can come in and they can say, wow, that was a great conversation. I really plan on getting that book. You need to not do that because then you can open it in your tab and then you might not get it. So you need to, before we do anything else, go in the chat, go to politicsandprose.com, order the book right now before anything else happens, so you don't forget, before your kids wake up, before your dog asks you for a walk, go get the book. This is such an extraordinary book. It is such a remarkable gift that was given to me to like begin this is the first book I read at the beginning of 2022. And I was like, man, it is going to be hard for other books to top this. I mean, it is a really, really remarkable text, and I cannot recommend it enough. So please go get it, open the tab, purchase, do your thing, support Politics and Prose, and support this book. Kathryn, as was mentioned, this was born out of an article that you wrote for The New Yorker. And we were talking a little bit about this before, but I'm curious for you, when in the process of writing the article for The New Yorker, did you begin to imagine the possibility that this could become a book, and that that writing about your father could then be put in conversation with falling in love with your partner?
Yeah, so not in the process of writing the essay, actually. The essay really never exceeded its own bounds while I was working on it. And in fact, for kind of a long time thereafter, I'd have to really think about the chronology, but that essay came out in February. And I think it really wasn't until like October of that same year, this is 2017, that it kind of suddenly turned itself into a book, or into part of a book. At the time that I finished it, actually, I really felt like, okay, I'm done. Like at the time, it was close enough to my father's death that it was still, it felt difficult and draining to write about grief. And I was not particularly motivated to do a lot more of it. But also it just felt done in the way that an essay does. It was conceived as kind of a self-contained thing. And so when it was finished, I had no desire to expand it. And then I talk about this some in the book, but this was this wonderful, obviously pre-pandemic era of my life when my partner and I were just kind of always on the road. She was working on a book, and that book took us back and forth to Alabama more times than I can begin to count. And we drove every time. So we were always on these endless road trips. And
you're driving from New York?
Either from New York, or at the time I was renting a place in the Hudson Valley, and we had the place we now live here on the eastern shore of Maryland. So these epic drives across a third of the country. And on one of those drives, it was the middle of the night and like the absolute middle of nowhere, somewhere near the Georgia-Alabama line or something. And we started talking about that essay and whether I would ever expand it. And I kind of stood my ground. I don't want to just write about grief more. And my partner, Casey, pointed out that there was a kind of analogous story, insofar the way that essay operates, which is also the way the first part of the book operates, is it's a story about the death of my father, but it's embedded in this larger exploration of the category of losing things in general. And Casey said, well, you could do the same thing for finding. Like you could explore this kind of converse category of finding and all the attendant joy. And obviously the most wonderful thing I've ever found is her. So right away, there was the moment of like, oh, that's interesting. There is this kind of mirror image piece that I could write, but I was still not quite there in terms of, this is a book. But she happened to utter the phrase that became the title of the book, Lost and Found. And the mind at 2 a.m. on a back road is a very strange thing. and in the moment, I really did just like resoundingly hear the and. And I lost my father and fell in love in relatively close sequence. So I had spent a lot of time thinking about kind of emotional conjunction, the fact that we experience a lot of things at once and we feel a lot of things at once. And so kind of immediately I was like, oh, actually it's not this 2-part book, it's this 3-part book. And that is very interesting to me. And I do want to write it.
Your family plays an enormous role in obviously the construction of this story. It's very intimate, it's very personal, it's about your father, but in being about your father, it's also about your sister. It's also about your mother. And you do this remarkable job of recreating these moments. There's this section on page 49. If you can see, if people could see, I dog-ear a lot, and there's like every page is basically dog-eared, which basically reduces the functionality of the dog-ear itself. But I just kept being like, oh man. And 4950, and it says, let's see, I also wrote it down here. But what I remember most from those first hours after my father died is watching my mother cradle the top of his bald head in her hand, a wife holding her dead husband without trepidation, without denial, without any possibility of being cared for in return, just for the chance to be tender toward him one last time. It was the purest act of love I've ever seen. And that image is at once so devastating and so moving, and so tender. And I'm wondering for you what it was like to sort of excavate those moments. And for me, I know that part of what writing is the very process of excavation. And so sometimes I'll write about a moment that I had not thought of more than I did when I began writing about it. Like the writing is the reflection.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering what it was like to revisit those moments, those like very specific, intimate moments for you.
It's a great question. You know, it's a strange thing. I have always said that I write to figure out what I think, which is true and really unfortunate, because it turns out a much better way to write is to figure out what you think and then write. You save yourself like thousands of words on the cutting room floor and endless hours. And it's all told not the best way to go about it. But I do often write to figure out like, well, what is the kind of intellectual core of what I'm working on here? What's my argument, or why do I care, or what matters here? So I was kind of surprised to learn that, as it turns out, when I'm working in this more intimate mode, I don't actually write to figure out what I feel. I do already know what I feel. So in that sense, it was not emotional in the way I would have expected it to be. I don't want to suggest it was like unemotional, but it wasn't. It certainly wasn't an act of catharsis. Like I think I had already had all the feel. It's not that I've had all the feelings I'll ever have about my father or losing him. Certainly, I haven't had all the feelings I'll have about my partner, since I hope we're together for a million more years. But of the feelings I was writing about, they were already deeply familiar to me and deeply kind of thought through and experienced. So I did not find it, by and large, and there's a couple of exceptions. I did not find it emotionally challenging to write most of the book. And curiously, the parts that I found myself weirdly most moved by in the act of writing them generally weren't about myself and the loss of my father, possibly because the other ideas or stories I was telling were fresher and more surprising to me. But I found it intellectually difficult, the way I always find writing intellectually difficult. But the emotions, I think, were already relatively settled for me.
And were you, when you were writing these moments that included other people, or maybe the moments that didn't even necessarily include other people? Part of what we know about memory is that different people remember the same event, sometimes very similarly and sometimes in fundamentally different ways. And so I can imagine the way that you and your mother and your sister and your loved ones, you all experienced his passing with your own idiosyncrasies, right? With your own specific memories, with your own specific sort of emotional texture. Did you, in the process of writing, were you having conversations with your family about how they remembered certain moments, not only of his death, but also of his life?
Yes, although mostly late in the process, partly for a really practical reason, which is I did actually have the whole book fact-checked. I'm a really big believer in fact-checking. Partly. Say again?
Shout out to the fact checkers.
Oh my gosh, no kidding, right? I mean, you only have to do it once or twice to realize how many horrifying mistakes you make, and you need someone here to take you to task. So I certainly at various points called my mom to say, like, did this happen? Or, do you remember this? Or there's a couple of moments from kind of my early childhood, which are like, I have this faint memory of this scene. Does this ring a bell to you? And same thing with my sister. But, I think you're absolutely right? I mean, people, look, we have different memories of every aspect of our life. And certainly people grieve very privately and differently, even when you're all grieving the same person. And even when, as in my case, you're from a very close family. And I think I was so mindful of that I tried quite hard to cleave extremely close to my own perspective. Meaning I really, in some ways, I probably could have painted a more complete portrait of my father, and possibly also a more complete portrait of grief, because people do kind of walk through it so differently, if I had had more conversations like that. But it struck me that then I would be, it just seemed incredibly incomplete and imperfect. I didn't feel capable of telling anybody's version of that story but my own, and I didn't want to pretend it was more than that. And in a curious way, a lot of the book looks elsewhere anyway. It looks to my father or my partner and to their respective families almost more than it looks to me. So when I was inside myself and inside intense emotion, I just kind of stuck to that, which might be a I feel that I'm not doing a very good job of answering this question, but the
No.
long and short of it is, I mean, look, I think in other families, that's why books like this can cause trouble in families. I feel very fortunate that it has not in mine, and my sister and my mom and my partner and her whole family have been wonderful champions of this book. But right, I mean, it's a tricky thing to tell a story about a collective experience like grief, or frankly, just like coming up in a family, when you're the one, who gets to put it out in the world as like the version, the story.
Did you, with regard to including so many people you love so deeply in the book, did you do a sort of ask for permission or ask for forgiveness?
Did I do either now that I think I don't know. I think my mom might actually be watching this. Mom, I wish you could pipe up. Well, I don't think I exactly asked for permission, partly because it's probably not very much in my nature, unfortunately, but partly because I know my audience, right? I know that, I mean, that's not strictly speaking to, I certainly said to my mom and my sister, actually, when I had the kind of kernel of the New Yorker essay, my dad's death at that point was in the very recent past. And I did call both and say, I'd like to write this, tell me if it would make you uncomfortable. And quite wonderfully, I think, my sister's feeling was, we're very, very close, and she's brilliant and amazing and honest. And I think her feeling was, it's not how I process the world, but I love that you do, and I would never stand between you and doing it. And she thought it was very beautiful in the end. And I think my mom, I hate to put words in her mouth, but I think that she's always grateful to have my dad back in the world in any way, and it's meaningful to her when people recognize him on the page. So no, I neither asked for permission, nor I hope did anything that would require asking for forgiveness. But I'll check in with my mom after we talk, and I'll text you.
There you go. Something I'm thinking about is this idea that one of the things you write about is how you say, my father, you realize that what you missed most about your father was what the world looked like to him. And I thought that was like a description of an iteration of grief that felt very familiar, but that I had not encountered in literature before, that had not been named like that. And there were so many moments in your book like that, where I felt like it was naming a feeling that I had experienced or that I had heard of, but not necessarily formulated. And I think that is, one of the best things among many that literature do is give you the language to make sense of your own experiences, both serve as a mirror to your own experiences, but also a window to so many others. When did you have that realization that was the thing that was among, if not the most difficult to manage after he died?
I describe a little bit of this in the book, but it actually was in a very specific moment. I went through this kind of strange phase after my father died when I really couldn't read, which is incredibly strange for me. I mean, normally, first of all, I love to read in general. And second of all, normally books are exactly my resource if I'm unhappy. So it was very odd. I couldn't even tell you why, but attention or energy or focus or just kind of lack of interest in all other stories. I couldn't read. And the one exception to that was I could read poetry. And it was a balm to me. And one night, my partner, who was very aware of the condition that I was in, picked up a collection of Whitman that we have, and she read me his incredible poem Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, which if you haven't read, those of you listening, you should just take a little bit of your evening and read it. And it's really beautiful. And Whitman does this kind of incredible job of conjuring the world before, during, and after his life. Like there's just this incredibly expansive sense of the universe, but compacted sense of the individual self. Like you get the sense of like we're so fleeting in the midst of all of this like beautiful swirl of humanity in the cosmos. And I was just listening, and these words are flowing over me. And my father actually was kind of a Whitman-esque character in a lot of ways. And I I had this incredibly painful insight in that moment that my father had, that I was not, it's an embarrassingly obvious insight, as actually many revelations are, right? Revelations are often about the completely self-evident, but my self-evident revelation was, I'm not the victim here, right? My father is the one who had the devastating loss. It is all gone for my father. You know, there's no world for him. It's complete. It's utter and total. Which of course might not be, you know, your cosmology. And some people would say, well, no, actually, it's not a total loss. But for me, death is a total loss like that. And in the moment of realizing that, I realized that what I was missing was mine, right? And what that was being in the presence of someone whose angle on the world was always interesting to me and always a gift to me. And that's what we are to one another, right? Like you and I sit here talking, and you have a set of observations and intuitions and thoughts that are utterly you. And it's such a gift to live in proximity to those, with all of us, right? But of course, when you're very, very close to someone and it's a loving relationship, as mine was with my father, and of course, when it's a parent and it's kind of shaped your entirety, it's devastating to lose that, you know, and I miss it to this day. I miss just, you know, I miss reading a book and calling my dad and saying, have you read this book? We should, you know, pick up How the Word Is Passed. I want to talk to you about it. So yeah, it was quite a specific moment of revelation about what exactly it was I was grieving, and grieving my father.
And one of the things your book does so well is that I felt so emotionally invested in your father, right? I mean, you really paint a three-dimensional picture of who he was. And I was like, man, I want to hang out with this guy. Like, I want to grab coffee and talk about books and talk about the sports and talk about, and like hear his laugh. I mean, it was so, your depiction of him was so rich. And I think that made his passing, even though it's so fascinating, because even though you know it's coming, I mean, it is the very premise of the book. You're devastated when it happens, because you've given us the sort of emotional texture of his interior life, but also of you all's relationship with him, right? I have a sense of, like, you know, at least through your eyes, like he and your mother's relationship, and your sister, you and he and yourself, he and Casey, you know, when they meet, and it, you know, almost felt novelistic in the sense that, like, you have created this character and made me feel invested in them, and then raised the stakes. In doing so, raise the stakes, and then their, you know, removal from the story it strikes a more intense chord than it may have. One other thing I'm curious about before we transition to the second part of your book is that you've done at the New Yorker like a wide range of sort of personal essayistic writing. And not even necessarily personal, but like essayistic writing, and then like deep reportage. So, you know, one of the pieces you're most famous for is the big one, which was like, you know, the reporting in there is, I mean, it's not, I was going to say Pulitzer worthy. You want a Pulitzer. It is like, it's the gold standard. I mean, it is remarkable the way that you incorporate your conversations with these people, these scientists. I mean, the lead of that story is something I always think about with the hands and the unfurled. I mean, I need to go back and read it. Do you have this was a book that didn't necessarily require reporting like that. I mean, it was very much of the self. What are those experience, you know, do you have a preference for one or the other? Do you like being out in the field and, like, you know, having less of yourself on the page and more of the you know, the subject matter being something away from you and your life, or do you prefer this, or are they just sort of different sort of emotional and intellectual experiences?
Well, first of all, I just want to thank you for saying that about my dad. There's nothing I would rather have readers feel after they put down this book than, man, I wish I could meet Isaac, and I wish I could meet Casey. I mean, I really, if you don't like the book, I don't care, but I really deeply hope you like the two main characters, because they're very, very precious to me. So I'm thrilled you had that reaction. You know, it's interesting. It's funny about reporting. I am not naturally a good reporter. I'm not naturally a reporter at all. I have to be kind of dragged into doing it. I am in a writer relationship. Casey, my partner, is a writer as well, and she's an incredible natural reporter and fearless and loves it. And she literally has to kind of like hand me the phone already dialed with it ringing. Like I've never gotten over my low level or frankly high level anxiety about it, and I don't think of myself as naturally gifted in that way. That said, I love the kind of writing that reporting enables me to do. And some of my favorite things I've ever written did require pretty extensive reporting. So if someone can just kind of like steadily push me until I do it, I love doing that. And funnily enough, I do think writing the book made me miss reporting some, that plus the pandemic, right? And so I am looking forward to doing some more of it. But yeah, I don't know. They're really different modes. And I remember very clearly when I was hired by the New Yorker, I had been working as a book critic and I was hired as a book critic, but it was made kind of clear to me that that was not a particularly tight-fitting jacket at that shop. And I remember being excited to try new things. And quite specifically, one of the things I wanted to try to do was write something personal, which is arguably kind of a return, but a return to like truly like, 8, 10, 12, 17, 18-year-old Kathryn, all of which are points in life when you're much too callow to have anything interesting personal to say. But yeah, so I wouldn't say that I have a strong preference. I'd be pretty surprised if I kept working in a personal mode, which isn't to say I don't think I'll do it again someday, but it's hilariously, someone just described this book as quote my debut memoir. And I was like, I mean, there's 6 more that are going to follow. Right. I don't think that's my plan, but who knows? Life is long and strange.
Pivoting to the found section, for folks who don't know, the book is split into 3 sections: lost, found, and in the found section, you're talking about your relationship with Casey and the sort of origin story and then the evolution of it, and then putting it in conversation with your relationship with your father, his passing, and the sort of commingling and coming together of those things. But similar to what happened with your dad, you like made me deeply emotionally invested in you and Casey's relationship. I was like, I hadn't met either of you in person, but had read so much of your writing, but I was like, I feel so invested in this relationship. Like I want all the good things to happen to these wonderful people. And one of the ways you do that is not just by saying like, I think there's a version of this and a version of a writer who writes this and they simply just say all the good things about this person. They say all the things they love about this person. But you describe these moments of courtship, of the sort of ebbs and flows of love that were so, again, that I'm going to keep coming back to this, but that you did so well in describing moments that I was like, I recognized that moment, but I had never read it before. And so there was a moment where you said, where you're describing, where is this? The walk you all took after a movie that you saw, and you're describing the ways that your bodies were sort of moving closer and farther apart, and how tuned in you were to the distance of your bodies at any given point during the walk. And as I read that, I was like, so many of us have experienced that, right? That like those first dates, those first couple interactions where you're like, did we brush shoulders? Was that on purpose? Was that on accident? Like, should we walk this far apart, that far apart? How close is too close? And it was so specific and so granular, but those specific moments coming together really create, it just creates this full 3-dimensional texture of what it means to like that process, that experience of falling in love. And so part of the writerly question is like, does that happen for you on a first draft? And if so, how? And then also like, had you written about, you've written personal stuff before, but writing about love, writing about the person you love more than anything in this world is like a very different experience to write about. Did you have a sense of how you were going to approach that when you sat down, or did you kind of sit down and you were like, I don't know what direction this is going to take, but I'm just going to kind of follow wherever my heart is in that moment?
It's really interesting. I knew the macro structure of this book from the beginning. I knew the 3 sections. In the case of Found, I actually knew exactly how it began and how it ended, that middle section. But when I sat down to write it,
the Billy section.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Oh, y'all. I mean, this is me it's not breaking the fourth wall, but like, man, the Billy boomerang is what I call it. It was.
That's nice.
Oh man, I was reading it in bed with my wife, and I was just like, oh snap! And I was just like, yeah, it's like 11 p.m. at night, and I was like, I think I woke the children. But it was, you gotta read the book just for Billy. I mean, it was the way I'm trying to like not spoil it, but that was that was incredible. That was
Well,
incredible.
this is music to my ears because it's probably my favorite part of the book as well. And it was, I mean, this, right? It's such a gift as a writer when you know something like that. Like you have a structural thing that you just know, like, oh, this is going to work for people in the audience who are like, well, what are they talking about? There's this character Billy who winds up playing a quite pivotal, but somewhat unexpected role. And it was really fun to write. But in terms of the love story, no, I never sat down and like thought like, okay, well, these are the like moments I need to hit. And yet, and Clint, don't kill me because I swear to you, this is not how I usually feel at writing. This is the opposite of how I usually feel about writing, but it was so easy. It was such a pleasure. And I truly, I mean, anyone who's known me for more than like 3 months knows that this is just not how I describe writing. I generally speaking, find writing pretty hard. And I write pretty slowly and painstakingly. But no, I had not written about love before. And it turns out I recommend all of you go write something about love. Writing about love is delightful. I mean, it really was just, first of all, it's so fun. It's fun to kind of revisit the story of how your relationship came into being, which we all know because we do it all the time, right? Like you go out with friends and they say, oh, how did you two meet or whatever. We love to tell those kinds of stories. But yes, it was by far the most delightful section of the book to write, and frankly, probably the most delightful thing to write in general in my whole career. And every day I would sit and kind of write a little farther into our relationship, and at night I would go up to bed and read Casey the pages, and it just unfolded. I don't think there's exactly one scene I wrote that was kind of part of the arc of our love story that did not wind up in the final book, but all the rest just kind of locked into place, which again, it never happens. 0 other times, and I doubt it will ever happen again.
No, I mean, it's I think we need space to write about easier things. I mean, I think that sometimes the intellectual rigor of a writer's work can be judged in ways that, not always explicitly, but that are sometimes implicitly tied to the intensity of the subject matter, right? And in many ways that's understandable, right? If you write about climate change, or you write about even in my own experience, right, I write about slavery, or you write about genocide, or you write about there's many horrible things in the world. I think sometimes the weight of the subject can feel like it both validates maybe for the reader, the time that they are taking and investing in reading it. And then for the writer maybe makes it feel as if they are doing something, even the language we have is insufficient, but like worthwhile, or of a certain social or literary or intellectual merit. And I think it's important, and I think your book is such a beautiful example of this, so important to like, even if this book had just been found, right, just no loss, just found, I think it would be so worthy of being a book and so important, because love is interesting because it's one of those things that has been written about and sung about and talked about, and it's the center of our lives. It's the reason, to my mind, the reason that we are here, the reason like humans, we are here to love and be loved more than anything else. And I really value this is a long way of saying that, like, I really appreciate that and I'm glad that it was easy to write, because these things shouldn't always be, I don't know, they shouldn't always be hard. And I think that there's a lot of merit in outlining that which is beautiful about our lives, you know, and the things that give us that joy and give us that sense of peace, right? I mean, that's what I got more than anything, was like this profound. It's interesting because you talked about your anxiety, and you wrote a little bit, you allude to it in the book, but like what I felt more than anything as I read was like you finding a sense of peace, you know, in Casey and in that relationship, like a home.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's such an interesting thought about, I think you're right about these kind of implicit ways that we valorize, I think sometimes really rightly and fairly, or we create some kind of interesting equation between the kind of stakes and gravitas of a topic and the merit of the writing, which again, sometimes I think makes a ton of sense. But I know what you mean. There's all this, like, there's these other vast domains of human experience to be written about. And in particular, in the context of love, it's funny as I sit here listening to myself talk about how that was easy to write. You know, part of what is funny about love, so I tried to like do my homework before I started this book and like go read about grief and read about love, do my homework. That's also called procrastinating, right? Like, it's just easier to read than to sit down and write. But you can read, you know, you could spend the rest of your life reading books about grief. There's gazillions of them. And I was a little shocked actually by how hard it is to read something about love that is not actually ultimately very sad. You know, they're almost always actually stories of death or divorce.
Yeah.
And I was a tiny, it's gratifying to hear you talk about the found section in the terms that you are, because of course we have this idea that actually happiness is not interesting, right? And is difficult to write about because it has a kind of blandness to it. And it wasn't my experience as a writer, and I'm glad it wasn't your experience as a reader.
It's I'm looking at the back of your book, and the Andy Borowitz, is it Borowitz or Borovitz?
Borowitz.
The first line of his blurb is, "Lost and Found is the most daring of books, a memoir by a happy person." And I was like, you know, that's I think about the memoirs I've written, and it's not to say that like the people who wrote them are or are not happy, but they are often about, and sometimes singularly about, these like really traumatic sets of experiences. But what you do is like you take a traumatic personal experience and then put it in conversation, as I said, with the, you know, this really remarkable and beautiful experience. And one of the things you talk about explicitly, specifically at the end of the book, when you're doing the and section, which it's hard to say which one is my favorite section. It's like, which one is my favorite child? I love them all for good reason. But I love how you describe the both andness of what it means to be alive, right? That like we never experience we are never moving through the world and only experiencing one emotion. We, you know, our spirits, our lives are filled with a multiplicity of experiences that shape us and resonate with us in ways that are at once difficult and at once beautiful. And one of at the end of page 220, you have this passage where you say, "Life too goes by contraries. It is by turns crushing and restorative, busy and boring, awful and absurd and comic and uplifting. We can't get away from this constant amalgamation of feeling, can't strain out the ostensible impurities in pursuit of some imaginary essence, and we shouldn't want to if we could. The world, in all its complexity, calls on us to respond in kind, so that to be conflicted is not to be adulterated. It is to be complete." And I was just like, yes, like that's, again, like that is, sometimes we want to put things into binaries that don't exist. And this is, as all my questions are, long-winded ways of actually asking a question. Did you know was the and always part of the structure you had in mind? Because you mentioned Casey was like, well, you could do a found, but when did the and become a part of how you were imagining telling the story? Because the and brings the lost and the found, and then the sort of emotional sensibilities that they represent, it brings those together.
Yeah, I knew from the beginning. It is actually it's literally why I wrote the book. Which is funny because I love my father and I love Casey and I loved writing, especially the found part of the book, but both parts. But I wouldn't have written it if I didn't have that kind of third piece of the and. Partly, I just think, for whatever reason, my mind works that way. I'm drawn to these kind of abstract categories of human experience and to the interesting struggle of trying to put them on the page. But also it just did feel, I guess, so I said earlier, I write to figure out what I think. And that was the moment where I was like, this is interesting to me. I have not actually thought about this idea before. I've thought a lot about grief and my dad, and I've thought a lot about love and Casey, but this feels to me like a fundamental feature of my life that I've never actually examined. And that prospect felt exciting and fun to me. And it also just kind of practically as a writer allowed me to do certain things that would have been tricky otherwise. The second part of this book, Found, is the love story, but Casey and I actually get married in the third part, in And, which felt right, as soon as I had the and category, right? Because what does and do? It joins things, and it is a section that looks at what it means to unite things, to unite families, to unite emotions, to unite experiences, and to kind of live as per the passage you were just reading, with the kind of complexity that brings. So from the get-go, I was like, I definitely, this is very interesting to me.
For audience members, we're going to hop into Q&A in a second. From you all, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A section at the bottom of the webinar. One of the things, I don't want people to leave this talk thinking that this book is singularly like you writing about your own experience with grief and love, because what you do, I feel like I've been saying in conversation with so many times, but it's the entire framework of the book, right? You're putting everything in conversation with one another. But like, I love the way that you bring in philosophy, and you bring in literature, and you bring in Greek mythology, and you bring in African-American literature, and you bring in all of these different literary lineages, and all of these different philosophical schools of thought, and all of these things that for me, they both reveal how absurdly well read you are, and also, I mean, it does such a good job of reminding us, you're doing this sort of back and forth of like the personal and the universal, right? And so it's like you talking about your experience, and then we're reading, Aristotle's, reflections of, these same topics, millennia before. Was that, I keep asking you about structure, but was that in your mind something that you were also cognizant of? Were you like, okay, I want to do this sort of back and forth, or did you, write yours and you were like, well, this, there's more to say, or I want to include what others have said and thought about these, these massive topics that are, central to our being?
I definitely always knew that there was going to be that kind of toggle between the personal and the more philosophical, or whatever you want to call it. And, partly just because, I'm just smart enough to know that many, many other people are vastly smarter, right? And if you can quote Aristotle, and if you can quote Elizabeth Bishop, and if you can quote James Baldwin, like, why wouldn't you, right? I mean, there are these kind of giants of intellect and emotion who have looked around and offered us these gorgeous insights on what it's like to be alive. And so, of course, I'm happy to poach them anywhere I can, but also because I never wanted to write a kind of straightforward memoir. love is very interesting. Grief is very interesting. I think this idea of conjunction is very interesting. My own personal life is frankly not that interesting. It's interesting insofar. I mean, it's exceedingly interesting unto me. Do not get me wrong, but
I found it very interesting.
Not like, I'm not like a celebrity writing a celebrity memoir, or I don't have some sort of outlier experience that would be sort of intrinsically gripping. I always knew that was going to be the kind of back and forth structure of the book. It was tough. Speaking of writing being hard, I would say probably one of the hardest things about putting the book together was figuring out the right pacing and the right balance of moving into a personal story and then panning out again. And I sort of knew at every stage of this book, including when it was done, like it's not going to be to every reader's taste. There is I think if you're famished for straight memoir, it's annoying to run into Aristotle, right? And if you're really interested in Elizabeth Bishop or grand conversations about loss and the nature of existence, you don't necessarily need to spend that much time with me and my dad. So I knew there was some trade-off on that front, but it's just it's how my mind works. And I'm looking at these gorgeous bookshelves behind you, Clint, and like I know what those bookshelves mean, right? Like that's what's in your mind, right? And when you think about the world, those are the voices that help you make sense of it. And I just think that's what it's like to be a certain kind of writer, the kind of writer I think you are, and the kind of writer I try to be. And so, there's always just this kind of beautiful clamor and chorus of other people who are like, but I said something about that, and it's wonderful to get to turn to them and sort of poach them and let your book be its own kind of mini anthology that way.
Yeah, no, I felt the same. I mean, in my own way, I felt very similar. I mean, my book was, is in many ways attempting to, it's this sort of triangulation, I guess, right? Like where it's my reflections of visiting these places that have this history, putting that in conversation with the experiences of the docents and the guides and the public historians who are tasked with telling the public these stories, and then the academic historians, the archivists, and the people who, without whom neither of our jobs, as the journalist or as the public historian, would be possible. And then so it is both an ode to their work, and also thinking about like what contribution can I make while also lifting up the work of people who have been thinking about these questions for, far longer than I have been alive. Mixing in, I'm going to mix some of my remaining questions with the questions of some of the attendees. One, did you write this book? Was this like people have like, I struggle to call it like a COVID book or pandemic book, but like your book, you were like, I'm going to write a book during the pandemic. Did you?
And have a baby.
And have a baby, all the things. Had you started writing this book before the pandemic, or was this something you came up with during the pandemic? And how have you been processing all this sort of macro level grief?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, so I definitely started this book before the pandemic. As I said, I'm a slow writer. I started this book in 2018, if you can believe it. And it was, it was very interesting to, this is a strange way to put it, but it felt like the pandemic like caught up with me almost in this weird way, because I had been thinking so much about loss as this incredibly expansive category that all kinds of wildly different things coexist within. It's very strange to suddenly be living in this moment when all of us are experiencing that so acutely. Like I think we've all expended an enormous amount of emotional energy since the pandemic began, trying to figure out how to tolerate and in a morally appropriate way live with the range of losses the pandemic has inflicted, because obviously those include at the most extreme end this just catastrophic loss of life, right? And also loss of livelihoods and loss of health, and real stress, loss of like serious leaps and bounds of education for school students. And then kind of alongside those grievous losses, it's like, well, is it like awful that I just like, miss going out on Friday nights, or that my kid didn't get to have a real high school graduation, or, I liked going to the grocery store. And I just think we've been living with the kind of range of losses that we have to contemplate in a more acute way than usual. And it was funny to kind of stride into that moment at a time when I'd already been thinking about that category for a couple of years. So the book is definitely not pandemic focused, but I hope that in some way it is a useful exploration of that category at the right time. And curiously, I actually think the "and" section might almost be more relevant in some ways than the loss section, just for some of the same reasons, right? I mean, it is a curiosity about life in the pandemic that, I mean, look, I think, as you know from the book, that we are all always living with multiple conflicting experiences simultaneously in various ways, but we really are right now, right? Like, it is extremely possible to be, really, really anxious about your, sibling, the essential worker who's exposed to COVID every day and has autoimmune issues, and also be actually really grateful that, you got all this time with your kids you didn't expect to have. And it's very possible, in fact, I think inevitable, to be grateful for that time with your kids and also like exhausted and frustrated because you have no childcare, like highly disrupted schooling. So I think we are living in a moment where that kind of "and" quality of life is really more evident than ever. So no, I didn't begin this book during the pandemic. I didn't conceive of it as a pandemic book, but it I think quite, for good or ill, and probably mostly for ill, does echo a lot of what's going on in our times.
Yeah, I felt that both the both-andedness of having children right before we got on, because my son is out. I have a 4-year-old. My son is out right now from preschool because of a COVID exposure. They have to quarantine for 10 days. Quarantine for 10 days. They can't go to school for 10 days. He's tested negative twice already, but we're on day 7. And so we were at the botanical garden most of the morning, and we had this like lovely time at the botanical garden, and we're, talking about nature and like just sitting watching birds. And I was like, wow, like, the COVID is terrible, but like, look at this time I get with my son. And then, right before this event, it's like, he's gotten out of bed 6 times and he's like, I have to pee. I need some water. Not that kind of water. Can I get sparkling water? And it's like, who is this child asking me for sparkling water at 8 o'clock at night? Get out of my face. And so when we think about the both-andedness of children, I feel like we all experience that every day. Somebody is asking, they're saying, thank you so much for this book, Kathryn, and this discussion. I lost my father a year ago and am finding his loss bearable, but that grief strikes in strange places. For example, going to a new doctor and being asked about my father's medical history. Mm-hmm. Do you find that grief catches you off guard?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that's grief's area of expertise, right? Is catching us off guard. And curiously, the farther you get from it, I think the more true that is. Like, grief can't catch you off guard very much right when you lose someone you love, because it's omnipresent. You're immersed in it. It doesn't have the kind of space to come tap you on the shoulder and surprise you. But as you start to think you are more at peace with a loss, that's when it can really kind of come get you. And we're talking about kids, and I did feel by and large at peace with the loss of my father in most ways. And it's so interesting. I have this little daughter, she's 5 months old. And even though I had intellectually thought about it beforehand, I was shocked by the force of my sorrow that my father would never be here. My dad loved kids and loved babies, and babies loved him. And it's so easy to imagine him with her. And he would have just been like so just delighted, just all over this kid. And conversely, that she'll never know him. I mean, we will obviously instill an idea of him in her to the best of our abilities. But yeah, of course, I mean, grief kind of follows the contours of your life, right? I mean, the most absurd example of this, to be honest, is like, I'm really bummed my dad can't read this book. Now, obviously, this book would not exist without my father. My dad read everything I wrote, and he was a great reader. And I mean, there's a kind of comic version of that, which I authentically think my dad would be like, are you kidding? You waited till I was dead to like put me in the New Yorker? Like, come on, but sure, it always does come and find you in unexpected ways.
Thank you for that. Do either of you have beloved memoirs on your shelves that you turn to? So maybe if you can give us a couple memoirs that have been really meaningful for you, that maybe they shaped the book, or maybe they have nothing to do with the book, but when you think of some of the favorite memoirs you've read, maybe sharing those.
Yeah, sure. Specifically about grief. Well, I am on the record in my first ever article as a New Yorker writer, as really, really admiring Helen Macdonald's H is for Hawk, which is just a tremendous book about the loss of her father that is also about so much else and just gorgeously written. And I can't recommend it enough. You heard me say earlier that I got a lot of consolation out of poetry while grieving my father. And this is not quite conventionally a memoir, but the poet Kevin Young wrote a book, a collection of poetry called The Book of Hours, that's about the death of his father, that is just remarkable and beautiful. And I see you turning to find it on your bookshelves.
No, I have I think I have that book somewhere. Here's Kevin Young's Jelly Roll. I've read that, because is that the one that's both about his father and his son?
Book of Hours is mostly about his father.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a beautiful book. I quite liked Chimamanda Adichie's new book. It's I think just a year old, Notes on Grief, partly because she clearly had a relationship with her father like I had with mine. It's an account of the loss of a very beloved father, and I was very moved by that. And I guess probably the book that my book is most, it's not right to say influenced by or in conversation book, but the book that lodged in my mind and probably contributed significantly to me writing this book was C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed. That's about the death of his wife. He fell in love quite late in life and lost his wife much too soon after that. And on the one hand, it's a tremendous book. He's an incredibly clear-eyed observer of himself and the world. And I think he writes just with tremendous eloquence about grief. But it's also almost fundamentally about, it's a theodicy. It's about the problem of suffering. He was a devout Christian. And curiously, despite spending his whole life as a devout Christian, had never actually really considered the problem of like, wait, but if I believe in this omniscient and benevolent God, like, why is he doing this to me? And so it's a real wrestling match with faith, and is obvious in my book, partly because I married a devout Christian. I am extremely not a devout Christian. I'm a quite secular Jew, and it was very interesting to me to read Lewis and think about the kinds of questions he was dealing with, and think about actually the need for a similar kind of secular wrestling match that thinks about these enormous existential and cosmological issues and mysteries, but without that kind of ground floor of faith in Christ that C.S. Lewis has.
I feel like I need to add all of those to my list. I would add, in terms of memoirs on grief that I find particularly moving, Elizabeth Alexander's The Light of the World, which is just, it's about the loss of her late husband, who died very young and very suddenly. And Elizabeth Alexander, she was the poet laureate. No, she was the inaugural poet for Obama the first time. And I mean, she's a stunning writer, and it's a book that stayed with me for a long time. Unfortunately, this event did not last for as long time as I would have liked. And we have to end. And so thank you, Kathryn, so much for this conversation. I need to just drive over to the Eastern Shore.
Please do. Next time your kid can't go to school, bring him on over here. We'll help you.
I mean, we still got 3 days of quarantine, so don't say it. We might be on the road tomorrow.
We'd love it. Thank you. This was such a pleasure. And I, in addition to thanking Clint and everyone who's listening, I want to echo something Clint said at the beginning. You definitely do not need to buy my book, but please, please, please buy Clint's book, How the Word Was Passed, or buy something from Politics and Prose. These independent bookstores make events like this happen. They make careers like ours happen. They are desperately important to our communities. I know you're sitting on your computer and there's a million ways to buy things, but please, if you can, buy something from Politics and Prose to thank them for putting this event on.
Yeah, and I wanted to thank you both, Kathryn and Clint, for being here tonight. I actually have one more question I wanted to sneak in really quick. What's on your nightstand? What's something that you want to recommend everyone to read next?
Clint, you have to answer that because I'm reading this absurd range of things for work that no one but me should ever possibly read. And because I have Work, the book, and a 5-month-old, I'm not reading anything I could in good conscience tell anybody else to read, except for your book, which I finished relatively recently. It elevated its way out of the stacks of boring workbooks about arson and so forth.
I appreciate that. Oh man, on my nightstand currently, I just finished Intimacies by Katie Kinamura.
Yeah.
And it is, I hadn't read Katie's work before, but she writes this feeling of like, she writes about melancholy so well. Like this character is so full of melancholy, and it sounds sad, like this character is so full of melancholy, but like it's similar to how I felt when I read Jhumpa Lahiri, right? Who like these characters are like kind of sad, but their interior worlds are so fascinating. And she writes about that state of melancholy and loneliness so well. And this, I think Katie's work does as well. So I just finished that book and I really loved it.
Great. Well, thank you both. And thank you to our audience. Just like Kathryn said, your patronage and dedication enable us to bring you this incredible programming, and we wouldn't be able to host these types of events without the book sales to support them. So you can follow the link in the chat to purchase Lost and Found, just like I did, or you can visit politics-prose.com. While you're there, check out our events calendar. We have an amazing lineup of great events just like this one from all of us at Politics and Prose. Stay warm, stay safe, and stay well read. Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks so much.